Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Kevin Navertel, and I'm a political science professor here at Moraine Valley, and I'm also the Democracy Commitment Coordinator. And one of the purposes of the Democracy Commitment is to try to promote civic literacy on campus and in our community. And so we thought this would be an excellent opportunity considering the importance of this issue. It's an issue that you'll get to vote on. So I just want to do a few thank yous first. I want to thank you to the faculty who brought their classes. I'm sure not everybody is here because they want to be here, but in part because their professor brought them. So thank you for that. I want to thank Cheyenne Meininger, our student interpreter. I want to thank Multimedia for helping us record this event, and Mike Crehan for helping us organize the Moraine Valley Room. So today we have two great speakers, and I want to welcome them to Moraine Valley and sharing their insight and making the commute out here to share their views. We have Mark Glennon, who's from Wirepoints, and we have Ralph Martire, who is from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. So before we begin, I just want to do a brief overview of what this topic's about. Currently in Illinois, we have a flat income state tax structure, and that is protected or restricted by the Illinois Constitution. So in this column over here, you see that all of us, anybody who's working in Illinois, we all pay the same percentage of our income in taxes. So the proposal is to alter that flat tax structure to a graduated income tax structure, somewhat similar to what we have at the federal level, where as you make more in income, you pay progressively higher in a percentage of income taxes. And that would essentially, since we currently all pay 4.95% of our income to the state of Illinois in income taxes, it would kick in at the $250,000 and above mark for the higher income structure. So next November, in about a year, you'll have an opportunity to vote for president, of course, and many other offices. But Illinois voters will also have on the ballot this referendum that is essentially asking you, yes or no, whether you would like to amend the Illinois Constitution to allow the state of Illinois to change their tax structure from a flat to a graduated tax system. So that's what this event is about. The process to amend the Illinois Constitution is that first it has to go through the General Assembly in a supermajority fashion, and it did that this past summer. And then it goes on to you, the voter, and that will happen again November 3rd of 2020, where you will have the opportunity to vote on that. So for this event, we really wanted to kind of lay out the arguments for and against this proposed change, and so that's what we'll do. I just want to briefly introduce our two speakers, and I again want to thank them for coming out to Moraine Valley. So first, we have the first speaker will be Ralph Martire. Ralph is at the Center of Tax and Budget Accountability. He's the Executive Director and Arthur Rubloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. The Center for Tax and Budget Accountability is a bipartisan 501c3 think tank that focuses on education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies. During his time at CTBA, Ralph has obtained numerous legislative successes, including the passage of evidence-based model education funding, a state earned income tax credit, passage of the 2011 temporary tax increases, amongst many others. He's received numerous awards for his work on education policy reform. He's received the L.D. Stevenson Award for Public Services, presented by the American Society of Public Administration to honor one individual with connection to the Chicago area that has made outstanding contributions to government and public administration over an extended period of time. And we also have Mark Glennon. He's the executive editor and founder of Wirepoints, an independent nonprofit company delivering original research and commentary about Illinois' economy and government. Before founding Wirepoints, Mark was previously originated and managed venture capital investments for Leo Capital Holdings. He's the winner of the Fellows Medal, awarded to Illinois Venture Capital Association for outstanding contributions to venture capital profession. He received his BA in Economics and Political Science at Northwestern University and his JD from University of Minnesota Law School, where he won the Dinard Award for the top law review contribution. He is taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Texas Law School in Austin, and is a regular columnist for Crain's Chicago Business. And finally, we have our moderator, Professor Jeremy Kingery, who is also an academic advisor here at Moraine Valley. So we have decided that Ralph Martire will begin. And Ralph, when you're ready, please join me in welcoming Ralph Martire. Yeah.
From the beginning, that's all I got to hit down there. Great.
All right.
All right, good morning. I'm Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, also the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. So any of you wanting to continue your careers at Roosevelt University, you need to talk to me. We got a great program there, and we love students from this college. My organization's a little odd, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. We are not nonpartisan, we are bipartisan. That means my board of directors has Democrats and Republicans on it that don't like or trust each other at all. And that's great for us at the staff because it lets us focus on best practices and data. So what I'm going to try to talk about is what are the best practices from a tax policy standpoint if you want your tax policy to work in a modern economy and you want it to treat taxpayers fairly. Now, the first thing you have to consider when you look at your tax policy is your private sector, right? Because you raise your tax revenue out of your private sector. So our private sector happens to be, and I'm sure you all know this, capitalist, correct? We have a capitalist economy. So it makes sense to look at capitalist principles of public finance when you're talking about how best to design a tax system to work in a capitalist economy. Are you with me so far that that's a logical thing to do? All right, who invented capitalism? Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And bonus question for the class, what year was The Wealth of Nations published? 1776, America and capitalism, born together, meant to be. Come on, meat-eating capitalists, every one of us. All right. So if that's the case, why not look to Adam Smith for a little instruction about how you're supposed to design tax policy to work in a capitalist economy? Here's the quote straight out of The Wealth of Nations. I'm going to read it so that you don't have to read the PowerPoint. I don't like to do this, but in this case, it's important enough. The subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities, that is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Homelord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. Fundamental principle of tax policy for a capitalist economy. Here's the kicker. There is no tax that can be designed to comport with ability to pay other than the income tax. Every other tax, by incidence, has to be regressive, has to take more out of the pay of a low or moderate income family than it does from an affluent family. The one tax that lets you balance that is the income tax. But that is only if you can have a progressive rate structure with lower tax rates on lower levels of income and higher tax rates on higher levels of income. No other tax allows you to actually satisfy what Adam Smith said you should look at when designing tax policy. All right, so we live in Illinois. And the reason Adam Smith said taxes ought to be designed to relieve the poor and burden the rich is because he believed in a capitalist economy, economic growth would always disproportionately, keyword, advantage top income classes over everyone else because of bargaining power. The folks at the top of the income ladder would have so much bargaining power over laborers, they would always be able to take a portion of the value of the input to the economy created by laborers away from laborers and into their own pocket through the bargaining process. Not evil or immoral, but it's how the system's going to work. So if the folks at the top are going to get this disproportionate benefit from the growth in the economy over time. They should have the greatest tax burdens to support the public sector that in turn supports this economic system that lines their pockets. Very rational theory. Was he right? This is Illinois-specific data, share in income growth in our state from 1979 to 2015. After inflation, the wealthiest 10% in our state got 108% of all the growth in income. Now, if you hate math, I will simply point out 100% is all of it. So, if more than all the growth in income went to the wealthiest 10%, that means literally 90% of our state, after inflation, was earning less at the end of the sequence than they did in 1979. Let's break it down even a little more finer. So, this shows you rate of growth after inflation in income for the wealthiest 1% in Illinois, that is that top red line, versus the bottom 99% of income earners in Illinois since 1979. You can see the wealthiest 1% in our state saw their incomes grow by 177% over this period. The bottom 99%, only 9. This really shows you the disproportionate share of income that goes to the top over the bottom and middle. And this has been going on now for decades in our state and our nation. By the way, our trends in Illinois very much mirror the national trends here. So, if for a long period of time you have this disproportionate share of income going to top income classes over everybody else, you will end up with a disproportionate share of wealth in your national economy, and we have. So this is US Census data. Y'all could run these numbers yourself at home if you're so inclined. Just go to the far left-hand column. According to the census, the wealthiest 10% in America now owns 77% of all of America's wealth. The further up the ladder you go, the more extreme it is. The wealthiest 3% own over half of all of America's wealth. Given that economic reality, given the principle that you need your taxes to somehow comport with ability to pay, the ability to pay is up at the top. It is not at the bottom and middle. And hence, because the income tax is the only tax that could be designed to shift burden from bottom and middle taxpayers to top taxpayers, it is the one tax you have to use to accomplish this core principle of capitalist tax policy. Not socialist, not communist, capitalist. So how does Illinois' tax burden get divvied up among income classes in our state under current law? Not the way Adam Smith would want it. So this shows you tax burden as a percentage of income in our state. From the bottom, 20, 40, 60, 80%, as you can see, all have the greatest tax burdens, whereas the wealthiest 1% only pay 7.4% of their income in taxes. That's the complete opposite of what Adam Smith suggested a tax policy should end up with doing, and one of the primary reasons for it is Illinois, by Constitution, is required to have one flat income tax rate across all income levels. We are constitutionally prohibited from modifying the one tax that actually can be modified to correspond to ability to pay. So, of course, our system doesn't work. It's highly regressive rather than progressive. That's problematic. So once again, I'm just going to show you what this does from a data standpoint. Just look at the far left-hand column. That compares the income between the wealthiest 1% in our state to the income of the bottom 20%. The blue bar shows you that before you take into account the Illinois tax system, the wealthiest 1% in our state earn 137 times more than the income at the bottom 20%. 137 times more. But after taxes, they earn 149% more. Literally, our regressive tax system actually worsens growing income inequality that's being created by our private sector economy. That is the complete opposite of what you're supposed to do with your tax policy. So you had this presentation before, it was great. They showed you what the tax rates would be under the new proposal that's on the table, but I want to be clear, this isn't what you are voting on when the vote comes up this November to amend our Constitution. The rate structure will not be in the Constitution. All that will happen is the Illinois Constitution will be changed to permit a graduated rate structure. Now, what has happened is the Illinois General Assembly passed a bill signed into law by Governor Edgar. Governor Edgar, shows you how old I am. Governor Pritzker, yeah, I did work with Governor Edgar. I am that old, I really am. Paleozoic era. Signed into law by Governor Pritzker that says if voters ratify this constitutional amendment, this will be the rate structure effective January 1. So we know what the rate structure will be. And I want to highlight one thing. Everyone gets the advantage of the lower rate structures at the lower levels of income except the people at the very top. So if you are earning $500,000 a year after taxes and you're married filing jointly, see that penultimate line there? You still only pay a 4.75% tax rate on your first $10,000 of taxable income. Then you still only pay the 4.9% rate on your next $90,000 of income. That's how a graduated rate system works. The one curveball in this legislation is the people at the very top. So if you're single and you have $750,000 of taxable income or more, or you're married filing jointly and you have over $1 million, you go from paying a flat rate of 4.95% to a flat rate of 7.99%. You don't get the advantage of that graduated system, but only at that very top. So how does that work? It does. It literally cuts taxes for 97% of the people who file a tax return in Illinois. 97% get tax relief under this proposal, pay less than the current system. Wealthiest 3% pays more. I will argue they could afford it. How much more? $3.6 billion, not an insignificant number. Does this solve all the state's fiscal problems? Let me think about it. No. The state has significant fiscal problems, but it's an important and crucial step forward if we ever want to get to the point in this state where we adequately fund education for all students, where we have the capacity to care for all abused and neglected kids, et cetera, et cetera. See, the state's fiscal problems, its lack of sufficient revenue to fund core services, has meant Illinois, despite being one of the richest overall states in the nation, we have the 5th largest economy and the 6th largest population. We rank at or near the bottom in funding every one of these core services. So we really do need some new revenue at the state level. The question is, how do you raise it so that we could fund these core services in a manner that's fair to taxpayers? And the answer is you have to amend the Constitution to allow a graduated rate structure, because any other tax you use would continue to overtax low and moderate income families who are losing income after inflation over time. So it does raise a lot of money. It helps. Our new top rate of 7.99% will not make us Taxachusetts. In fact, it's within the realm of the other top tax rates in Midwestern states. You look at Minnesota, their top tax rate is 9.85%. Iowa, 8.5, both higher. Wisconsin, about the same, 7.6. The difference is, look at where those top rates kick in these other states. In Minnesota, that top rate kicks in at only $163,000 of income. Ours doesn't kick in until $750 for single, $1 million filed jointly. Iowa, that top rate kicks in at only $71,000 of income. So the bottom line is the rate structure is rational. It raises revenue fairly. It will significantly help the state balance its budget, and it will do so while relieving tax burden on low and moderate income families. But I don't want to oversell the tax relief. I want you to know the data. So if you look at this red line, that shows you tax burden as a percentage of income under current law. And you can see it's much higher at the bottom 20% than it is for the wealthiest 1%. See that red line? The blue line is how tax burden would change under the proposal. And what you could see is it's lower for everyone until you get to that wealthiest 3%, and then it kicks up. It's not a lot lower. The reason it's not a lot lower is the state is financially broke, and so it needs revenue. So this has to be a net revenue raiser. But to be very clear, it raises revenue while reducing some tax burden for low and middle income families, and it is the only tax you can use to do that. So it works. But it's also not an eat the rich strategy. Look at that final tax burden. The wealthiest 1% will still have the lowest tax burdens as a percentage of income in our state after the Pritzker proposal becomes law. So, final thing that's always raised against going to a progressive rate structure, graduated rate structure, is, gee, it's going to kill the economy. No, it won't. There have never been peer-reviewed studies that find any statistically meaningful correlation between a state tax policy and its economic growth. Other things matter more. One of my favorites of all these, the Congressional Budget Office, which is a really good research organization, did this massive study of not just state tax policy and its impacts on the economy, but federal. And federal taxes are much bigger than state taxes, much more important. They still found no statistically meaningful correlation between changes in tax policy, even at the federal level, and what happens in the economy. But they found one thing that had a statistically meaningful correlation to encouraging businesses to hire more people. Do you know what it was? Glad you're all seated, because this is going to be a shocker, so breathe deep. I'm about to tell you. Apparently, businesses will hire more people when there's growing demand for what they're selling. No, crazy. Microeconomics actually works. Apparently, if a business needs added capacity, it'll hire the people to generate that capacity. Nothing else stimulates business growth, which means all the rhetoric you hear that if we just cut taxes for businesses, the money they'll create jobs. No, they won't. If you cut taxes for a business and no one's buying more of what it is selling, why would it hire someone to stand around the water cooler? It's going to profit take. It is absolutely not going to create jobs. We've been misled by a lot of the public rhetoric on this subject. So, two clear examples of changes in tax policy that sort of buttress this argument that there's no statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and your economy. Number one, Kansas, they cut taxes at the top, claiming that there'd be a trickle-down effect and their economy would grow and blah, blah, blah. It didn't happen. They had huge deficits and huge economic problems after the tax cut. And then Minnesota, which raised taxes significantly after Governor Dayton got office. In fact, that they went to the number 3 highest tax rate in America, going up to 9.85%. All that tax increase was on the wealthiest. Their economy took off after the tax increase. They not only balanced their budget, but they lowered their unemployment rate and created jobs at a much faster rate than they did before. This doesn't mean you tax yourself to prosperity. That's not what I'm saying. What it does mean is there's not this statistically meaningful correlation between how you design your taxes and long-term economic growth. Other things matter more. So the important thing with tax policy is just to get it right. We are getting tax policy wrong. One way we are getting it very wrong in Illinois is we are overtaxing low and middle income families and we are undertaxing wealthy families. And the only tool in the kit to fix that is the income tax, and then only if you can make it a graduated rate structure. So I'm going to end there, but that's the case for why Illinois should support amending its constitution to permit graduated taxation.
All right, thank you, Ralph. I was so excited to get us started. I forgot to mention our format. So real quick, what we're going to do after, now that Ralph has given his side, what we're going to do next is have the opposing side presented by Mark Glennon present their side, and then we're going to have about 10 minutes each for each side to respond to the other's points. And then we're going to have a couple of questions by our moderator, and then we're going to open it up to you. So there will be time for your questions and comments. So at this time, I'd like to invite and help me welcome Mark Glennon from Wirepoints.
Can you get that started for me, Kevin?
I can try.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity to discuss both sides of this. I'll get straight to the kind of summary of what our position is here. The revenue, the additional revenue that is going to come from this tax is really pretty trivial. It's $3.5 billion. That's, the range is 3.4 to 3.6 billion. That's not going to get much. We have a fiscal crisis in Illinois that I want to go through, and I want to put this in perspective and explain how the tax will fit into that crisis and in fact worsen it. We don't believe in this tax because it's really just throwing more money into a bottomless, corrupt pit. That's what we've been doing constantly. Remember, we had a temporary income tax increase a few years ago. What did it solve? Nothing, and it wasn't temporary. And we had a permanent tax increase in 2017, another $5.5 billion. What did it solve? Nothing. Very little, actually. What we need to do is make reforms that make tax increases less necessary. A tax increase with no reforms is what's on the table, and that won't work. How bad is it? Again, to understand the context of this, you really have to understand the nature of our crisis. It's a state and local crisis plaguing all units of government in Illinois. You often hear about balanced budgets. The mayor of Chicago spoke about, we have an $830 million deficit in Chicago that she needed to cut and fill, which she claims to have done. Every year, the state claims that it balances its budget. Forget those budgets. What's happening is debt is increasing at a rapid pace. That's where the losses get stuffed and hidden. Those budgets you hear about, and this is a good lesson in kind of government economics, those budgets mean nothing. They're just cash flow predictions about how you're going to balance your cash through the course of the year. It's as if you're sticking your bills on the credit card or in your mortgage and paying your bills that way. That's what Illinois is doing. That's where the problem is. This shows the actual numbers, not from the budgets, but from the financial statements, audited financial statements that come out every year. And it's a disaster. We're losing money at a clip of about $50 billion, $10 billion a year. So since 2002, we're down $184 billion. I mean, these are astronomical sums. And kind of keep this in perspective, the total state budget right now is about $40 billion, the new budget. So, when imagine if you had a company and you're losing $10 billion a year and your total budget is $40 billion, it's not sustainable. It doesn't work. Something is fundamentally wrong. And $3.5 billion of new revenue isn't going to fix it. Same thing for the city of Chicago, CPS, and smaller cities across the state are in even worse condition. This is their net position. The city of Chicago has basically been losing about $1 billion a year despite their claims of balanced budgets. The epicenter of our crisis is probably in Chicago, because if you're in Chicago, you have all these overlapping jurisdictions. It's not just Chicago taxes you have to pay, but the Chicago School District, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, Cook County Forest Preserve, it goes on and on. Add those all up, and each household in Chicago is liable for $144,000. That's for, legacy debt. It's not to pay future services or anything else. And think about that for a minute. Most of Chicago, 40% is at or near the poverty line. They can't be asked to pay more. They shouldn't pay more. If you take the progressive assumption, for example, that only the top 10% should be taxed and try to fill this hole, that would be $1.4 billion a year per household. Well, they're not going to pay it. Something's wrong. It's not going to get fixed that way. One of the places where the crisis has really burned out of control is property taxes and home prices. Ralph talked solely about the income tax. That's only a small part of our tax structure here. We have, the income tax raises about $20 billion a year. Property taxes raise $30 billion a year. Plus, you have all these crazy fees that Illinois is notorious for, especially in Chicago. These are effective property tax rates. I mean, if you took the actual tax bill and compared that to the true value of your property, what is the rate? Our rate on average across Illinois is twice the national average. It's about 2.3%. And It's particularly bad in the south suburbs, where I grew up. Average rates there are over 5%. Well, that's just confiscation. I mean, you're really you're seizing the property from those people. Tens of thousands of people in the south suburbs, mostly working class, have had their life savings in the form of their home equity taken from them. There are other reasons that are pushing property prices down in Illinois, but clearly property taxes come straight off the top line because, to qualify for a loan and add up how much your monthly bill is going to be, property taxes are part of it. 3.5% rates, 3%, over 3% are common across the Chicago region, by the way. It's not just the south suburbs. All of McHenry County is over 3%. Rockford, many other places. This looks at the growth in home values. The place where this pans out is in property values. So our property values have been suppressed. This represents the growth in median home values. You can see we're badly lagging the rest of the country. Well, what would happen if our homes had appreciated at just the national average? We worked with a Zillow economist and did a report on this. It has cost us $250 billion over the past 10 years. I mean, that's a lot of money. When you think of $250 billion coming out of the pockets of people, that they were probably going to use for their retirement or something else, that's a huge impact. The taxes essentially get capitalized in home values that way. A big part of our problem is retirement costs. It's not the only problem we have, but it's public employee pensions and health care that are driving the crisis and squeezing out spending for other things. It now consumes a quarter of Illinois' budget, and it's getting worse. This is a report that I have up here showing, done not by us, but by J.P. Morgan, managing director, where he estimated what the true cost, if we were actually paying to cover those expenses properly, and we're not. I hope you know that we're not funding pensions nearly to the amount that they need to be. We're not funding future health care costs for those retirees at all. That's an entirely unfunded liability. Well, if we were properly setting aside the right amount of money, how much would that cost? 51% of our budget would have to go at the state level to just to public employee health care and pensions. In Chicago, it's even worse. It's 60%. This compares the growth in pension benefits. Now, this doesn't mean that individual benefits has gone up by this amount, but this shows that the real problem in the pensions is the growth in those actual liabilities. In past years, we kept making the benefits more and more generous. We give an automatic 3% increase every year to retirees under the name of a cost of living adjustment. It's not really a cost of living adjustment because inflation hasn't nearly paced at 3%. So that red line at the top is the actual growth, 1,000% increase since 1988. That's just not sustainable. No other metric, not inflation, GDP, anything else compares to that. 8.7% annually is that compound average growth rate in those pension liabilities. Let's talk about the overall tax burden. Again, Ralph cherry-picked this and focused on the income tax only, but you have to add in all those other taxes. A Kiplinger finance study came out last month that said we are the least tax-friendly state in America. Now, in truth, these numbers are debatable. Ralph has different numbers. We like to use the Tax Foundation's numbers, which show us at about number 4. You find other studies occasionally. Wallet Hub says we're number 1 or number 5, depending on the year. But there's no question that we are already a very heavily taxed state. One of the consequences, of course, is that people are leaving. This is a cataclysmic problem. We've had 5 years of population loss in Chicago and across the state. Only West Virginia is worse than Illinois in population loss. We will not be able to restore Illinois to economic stability unless we not only halt that, but restore growth. We've got to grow the tax base and not shrink it. This shows that total change in population. That's us in the red, over the last 8 years, shrinkage. Is it just the weather? A lot of people say that. I mean, even heard an analyst from S&P that rates bonds say, well, we think it's the weather that's driving people out. No, all our neighboring states are gaining in population. The progressive tax scheme, $3.5 billion, again, won't solve anything. It is a blank check. As Ralph pointed out, those rates that he discussed are not locked in. Because that $3.5 billion is so inadequate, it's only a question of time before those rates get jacked up on everybody, and it's going to hit middle-income taxpayers. I was joking with Ralph before we started that we're actually on the same side. I think Ralph is sincerely interested in trying to help the little guy, people with less income. So are we at Wirepoints. We just have a different way to get there, and we think his approach, more taxes and no reforms, is going to get the same results that it's gotten in the past 20 years in Illinois. More flight will ensue. Ralph says people don't move because of taxes. Well, the top investor in the country, probably Warren Buffett, said, don't put a new business in Illinois. They're coming for your money, is what he said. He was referring to these pension liabilities and talking about states like Illinois and Illinois and New Jersey. When you have investors like that refusing to come here, that's part of our population problem. We don't have employment growth as a result. People do leave in part because of taxes. Yes, there are at least one statistical study showing that people move because of that. It was done recently by Stanford University about California's recent tax increase. But more importantly, there are no pertinent studies on this because no state has ever been in this unique situation that we have. A combination of corruption, taxes, the impossibility of filling that, the deep pit that we're throwing money into. And most importantly, people are looking forward. They know this, and they're seeing the fact that there's all these accrued liabilities, which are tax bills stuck in the drawer, and that's what's scaring them away, especially rich folks. We want to treat the problems and not the symptoms. Throwing $3.5 billion at it will only treat the symptoms. Pritzkers Promise, nothing has been more oversold than what this tax increase will supposedly accomplish. Remember that story in the Bible, the loaves and the fishes? I'm no expert in the Bible, but where 5 loaves and 4 fishes or whatever it was kept feeding the multitudes. Pritzker has promised that 3.5 billion times, many times over. He claims it's going to pay down the structural deficit, give us property tax relief, pay for the pensions, and all these other progressive ideas that he had, from better health care, more education spending, everything else. You could put the entire $3.5 billion into pensions, just the state pensions, never mind the 650 other pensions across the state. Put it all into the state pensions, and you would only get to the point where we would be breaking even. It would do nothing to reduce that humongous unfunded liability that we have, which is officially $137 billion. It is more like $200 billion based on better numbers. We ran our own analysis. What would it really take to try to cover those problems, including $10 billion of additional spending like Pritzker promised during the campaign? The numbers get you just astronomical. They'd have to creep into hitting lower income and middle income taxpayers. You have the rates put up there. You'd have to soak the rich to an extreme amount and hit middle income taxpayers. Instead of raising taxes, we need drastic reforms across the board. This slide is meant to be a hodgepodge because there's such a long list of them. 20 or 30 reforms, large ones and small ones, starting with the big one, which would be amending the Constitution to overcome our Supreme Court's interpretation of the Pension Protection Clause that says pensions cannot be adjusted. Other states have been fixing their pensions. They've gone along. We're not. Our court says it's a suicide pact. We got to fix it. Another big one would be allowing some of these smaller cities the option of going into bankruptcy, which unfortunately is going to be inevitable for some of them. Some of the other specific kinds of reforms, just to pick out a few. You know, we have by far the most units of local government in the country, 6,900 of them. Those got to be consolidated or gotten rid of. Doesn't mean we're necessarily going to cut services. Keep the services that they're providing there important, but the administrative overhead from all that is ridiculous. We need changes to the ways we negotiate contracts with public unions. This is an independent study that was done that shows we're one of the most friendly to public unions, and the consequences of that are things like the Chicago teacher strike. Teacher strikes are barred in most states. They're barred by all their neighbors, and they got a contract that's too generous. Unfortunately, for a broke city like Chicago, it's just unaffordable. So on this question of whether you're running off people because of taxes, you got to put it in perspective and just apply some common sense. I bet you all know people that are leaving or thinking about leaving. It's not just because of taxes, but taxes are part of it. Instead, we got to bring down the cost of living, make things more affordable for working class people. We have to make our government friendly to employers. We have many people in the state legislature who are outright hostile to business. That's got to change. And of course, there's corruption. Every day you turn on the news, there's another horrifying story. So do you trust them? You know, they're asking you, there's no tax cut, by the way, for the lower incomes here. It's trivial. You know, if you look at those rates that Ralph put up, a middle income person would get a tax cut, middle income household with 50, 100, maybe 200 bucks. It's token. They put it in there as a token gesture. It's a tax increase on the rich. You can't solve this inequality problem that Ralph is talking about, which I sympathize with, by taxing the rich at the state level, because people will flee. I don't really care about protecting rich people. I do, however, want them here. I want them productive. I want them investing here. I want them making charitable contributions here. I don't want people like Warren Buffett saying to stay away. That's the problem that has to be fixed. And they're corrupt. I mean, there'll probably be 20 state legislators indicted at the end of this federal probe. Who knows how many more in the Chicago City Council. Do you trust these people with giving them another $3.5 billion? That's all I got for now. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So at this point, each of the two presenters gets an opportunity to, address some of the points made by the other side, and then we're going to have some questions and comments.
You go from here? Sit down here? Yeah, grab the mic.
Do either of you need your PowerPoints or anything?
No.
Okay.
Ralph in his presentation said that only the income tax can be progressive. That's largely true. But he spoke about the importance of growth, economic growth, as another way to solve the problems of the working class. That's exactly right. I was very surprised to hear him say that lower taxes don't stimulate growth. That's precisely the complaint about the Trump administration, that we're living on a sugar high, that because of the 27 tax cuts, that's an artificial stimulation to the economy. Right now, we're getting good results for working class people. Unemployment is at a record low, and real incomes have gone up, wages have gone up. That's the real solution to this, is trying to drive demand, as Ralph put it, demand for labor as well, making a competitive situation where employers need more laborers, and that bids up the price of those laborers. That's what's happening across America right now. That's not to say that I fully agree with the tax cuts that Trump made. I don't think he should have cut the top rates by 3%, I think, on the top earners. That's where, if you want to address inequality through tax policy, it has to be done at the national level, not at the state level, because it's a competitive situation with states. And we're not the only ones facing it. It's New York, New Jersey, California are facing this problem as well. I think I covered many of my other rebuttal items in my talk, and I went a few minutes over, so I'll turn it over to you, Ralph.
Well, thanks. So first thing, I'm going to admit I'm guilty. I actually limited my comments in my presentation to what the topic was, the amendment for the fair tax. So I focused on that because that's what I was told to address. But you want to talk about tax policy overall, I'll make it very clear that the design of our tax system in Illinois has been one of the primary reasons the state has run up a pension deficit and in fact has high property taxes. So let me give you a comprehensive view of tax policy in Illinois. If you look at the Federation of Tax Administrators data sets, and all they do is they collect total revenue raised from all your taxes and fees, no modeling, no complex stuff. Who here does stats or has done stats? Anybody? So you know if you do a lot of complex modeling, right, you can make your assumptions, have your outcomes be whatever the heck you want them to be. So you want to avoid these complex models and just look at simple math. So according to the simple math, you take every tax and fee charged by any unit of state or local government here in Illinois, that's a dollar amount, that's what we take to support public services, and you divide it by personal income in our state, and we rank 27th in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income. 27th lowest, bottom half. 5th largest economy, 6th largest population, bottom half in total tax burden. Now, where we are high tax is the property tax. When you isolate that one tax out, we are always in the top 3 to 5 in reliance on property taxes. Why is that? Because for generations, the state of Illinois has had what's called a structural deficit, meaning its tax revenue growth looked like this over time, but its cost growth looked like that. And based on what? Just providing the same level of services from one year to the next, our revenue growth wouldn't support continuing the same level of services, no changes in law, no added program, because our revenue system doesn't work in the modern economy, but your costs at a minimum grow with inflation in the modern economy. So that's been the driving problem in Illinois for generations. So rather than solve it by fixing our tax policy, and as I indicated during my presentation, going to a graduated rate structure is simply one of the fixes we have to make to our tax policy. We have to look at our sales tax base, we have to look at some other things. But because our tax policy didn't work, and because politicians are always afraid to raise taxes, I don't know if you're aware of this, tax is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X that gets people all excited in America. I'll let you guess what the other one is. Because politicians don't like dealing with taxes, they found a way to borrow to spend rather than tax and spend. So, you've probably heard the rhetoric, tax and spend liberal. It's a completely silly thing to say. If you tax and spend on police, are you liberal? No. You tax to spend if you're responsible. What you're saying is these are core services we need to provide to our population, and we need to cover the cost of paying for those core services with current tax revenue. That's what you're saying, and that's the responsible thing to do. We've never done that in Illinois. So because our tax policy didn't work, what they decided to do was not pay into the pensions what the pension systems were owed. They simply wrote an IOU and let that IOU compound interest and say, we'll pay it back someday down the road. And then in 1995, they actually put in a payment plan that looks like this. It's completely backloaded. And in fact, it was such an irresponsible payment plan that for the first 15 years, it continued the practice, but now legislatively authorized, of completely underfunding the pensions and blowing up the unfunded liability. But to hit a couple of points you raised, no data indicate that benefits are in fact any part of this problem. It's the aggressive borrowing against what was owed the systems, and then the irrational, unaffordable, and backloaded repayment plan put in place to cover them. And so part of the fiscal solution when you're trying to get rid of a structural deficit is to re-amortize this debt in a rational way that you could cover with tax policy that lowers the unfunded liability every single year and that allows you to continue to fund core services. And let me go there. So a lot was made of trusting Springfield. Show of hands who trusts Springfield. If any hand goes up, please share what you're smoking with the rest of the room. It's soon to be legal, so you can go ahead and do that. Of course you don't trust Springfield. But here's what I do trust about Springfield. Over the last 30 years, over 9 out of $10 every single year has been spent on 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Which one of those is the bad priority we ought to be cutting the heck out of to balance our budget? Education, healthcare, social services, or public safety? That's where over 9 out of $10 gets spent every year in Springfield. Now, is there waste, fraud, and abuse? Let me think about it. Yeah, it's Springfield, right? We've had 5 governors go to jail. But these service categories, which consume the vast majority of our resources, are all underfunded. We rank at or near the bottom of the nation in covering the cost of each of these based on our demographically driven needs. And the reason we do such a poor job of funding these items is because our tax policy has been so poorly designed. It doesn't grow with the modern economy, but our costs do. So, one consequence, as I said, was borrowing irresponsibly against the pensions and taking this borrowed money and using it to hide what's called the structural deficit, which is that mismatch between revenue growth and cost growth. The other thing they did, and this is why your property taxes are too high, is they said, hey, we at the state have the power to push the primary obligation to fund some of these core services away from us and down to the local level. So they decided to do that for what area, do you think? K12 education. So much so that Illinois is the national outlier right now in reliance on property taxes to fund schools. We rely more on property taxes to fund K through 12 education than any other state in America, and we rely less on state-based tax revenue to fund public education than any other state in America, by a long shot. So what does that mean? Couple of things. From an education policy standpoint, it means we've tied the quality of education a child's going to get in our state to the property wealth of the community in which the kid lives. So if a kid lives in a property wealthy community, they get a world-class education. If they don't, not so much. Good idea? That's a lousy idea. It is why historically Illinois has had the least equitable school funding system in the entire country. Now, we just passed a piece of legislation in 2017 called the Evidence-Based Funding Formula that is intended to shift how the state of Illinois funds K-12 education. It designs an adequacy target of resources that every school district needs based on the demographic demands of the students it serves. So if you have a lot of low-income kids or special needs kids or English language learners, the model automatically adjusts and provides additional resources so that your school district can implement those evidence-based practices which have been shown over time to actually enhance student achievement. Good news, we changed our model to get rid of that old system and go to one that will work based on what the evidence indicates is the right thing to do. Absolutely the best practice. The problem? We are $6.8 billion short of funding K-12 education to the level it needs according to the evidence of what works. $6.8 billion. We only provide K-12 education with about $8.2 billion from the state. We almost have to double the state's investment, but we can't because we have a structural deficit. We have a structural deficit because our tax revenue doesn't grow with the economy, but our costs do. We have one tax that we could impose that's paid by wealthier folks and not paid by low and moderate income folks, and that's the income tax, but only if we could have a graduated rate structure. But there's no question the state needs more revenue because the driving problems of our deficit have always been bad tax policy, not overspending. We're a low spending state despite being a high population state. Now, finding that adequate revenue, we could either keep the current flat tax, raise revenue with that, so that everybody does have to pay more,
Or we could go to a graduated rate structure and literally recognize the fact that in the private sector economy, low and moderate income families are losing income over time after inflation, and all the growth in the economy is going to the top. You pick what's the more rational way to go. And as for, well, they need so much money, whatever. Well, you made a couple of comments about that. Number one, additional money won't help. Really? Wait a minute. When you are bleeding deficits, enhancing your revenue doesn't help lower that deficit? In what world does that math work? I mean, I just fundamentally don't understand that comment. But number two, indication was things have gotten worse since the state first temporarily increased its income taxes and then permanently did. No, they didn't. Our current accumulated deficit in the state's general fund, so we are going to spend about $40.2 billion this year, $13 billion on hard costs and about $27 billion on services. Our accumulated deficit is $7.7 billion. In 2011, when they passed the first of those tax increases, it was almost $17 billion. The tax increases have, in fact, every single year, helped reduce this deficit over time until we got Governor Rauner. And then Governor Rauner said, let the tax increase expire, and even though he cut spending dramatically, our deficit started to blossom again. So when he took office, the deficit was $6 billion. When he left office, it was back up to 12 because he gave away revenue. Look, it's never fun to say we need more taxes.
I don't want to
look
cut
at
you
all the
off, but
data,
we do need to get to our
need
question
more
and answer
taxes.
period.
Yeah, you'll filibuster if you...
Well, you just threw so much stuff out there that I felt
Well,
needed responded
So
to.
do I.
All right. So,
Ralph,
well, you forego.
Can I have a minute? Or
What do
whatever you think.
Okay, go ahead. 1 minute, yeah.
You're making the case against your own proposition. What of those things, all those things that you just mentioned, are going to be solved by $3.5 billion in new revenue?
What I said was it's part of the solution, it's not the whole solution. So if you listen to what I say,
Yeah, right.
it is one of the key components of the solution.
Do go
you
on.
need to do other things.
Do go on. You want to raise taxes on what? What other taxes do
No,
you want?
I want to re-amortize the pension debt. I want
No,
to
you want to raise
the
taxes on other things.
I want to expand the sales tax base to include consumer services.
Higher sales taxes. Okay, what else?
No, expanded base. Of the 45 states with a sales tax, Illinois taxes less of the modern economy than any other state. Why is that? We only tax products.
I thought
pretty
I
much
was
the
just going
sale
to
of
get a minute
goods.
here.
Well, the sale of
Ralph,
well,
well,
let me give
you're
them the
filibustering
rationale. You
again.
asked me the question. I'm going to answer.
Gentlemen,
Yeah,
please.
no, the sale of products only makes up 17%.
We have a
of our
limited amount of
economy.
time here,
We don't tax
and we do want to
services.
provide-
That's over 70% of our economy. You need the math to work.
Gentlemen,
Your math
please.
doesn't
I don't want to
work.
have to cut microphones, okay? We do have students here who I want to give them the opportunity to ask questions, okay?
I want students to have good information.
Okay. Okay. So, as Professor Nevital mentioned, my name's Jeremy. I do see a few of my former students in the audience, so one rule I always implement in the classroom is that we keep it civil. So for anyone who does have any questions, we can agree to disagree, but we do believe, in an educational institution in being respectful and keeping it civil. I'll go ahead and start, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I have two questions for both of you. First, in your honest assessment of Illinois' fiscal situation, is inaction on revenue a realistic option? Why or why not? And if you each want to take, 2 minutes to respond to that.
In Illinois, we are past the top of the curve. That's something called the Laffer Curve. There comes a certain point where if you raise taxes any further, it will backfire because you drive off the tax base, they leave, they are forced to engage in more tax avoidance activities like making charitable contributions, which is a good thing, or investing in municipal bonds, which are tax-free. We already have people leaving. How much more evidence do we need that people are fleeing? I can't prove where we are in the Laffer Curve. He can't disprove it. But if you just look around, look at the news, look at comments by the companies that are leaving, comments by people like Warren Buffett, more taxes are going to make the problem worse. You might get your $3.5 billion in tax revenue initially, but it takes a long time for people to move. I bet you know a lot of people who say, I'm out of here, after my kids get out of school, or, as soon as I can find a job, or as soon as I can sell my house, which is probably underwater on its mortgage. It takes a while for that curve to backfire, but that's coming.
If you want to address the question.
No, we can't. We need new revenue. The Laffer Curve, so since this is an educational setting, has been entirely discredited. I would ask you to go to the websites of either the Institute for Tax and Economic Policy or the Economic Policy Institute. They will have links to all the research that discredits the Laffer Curve, but it has been completely debunked. That's number one. Number two, you keep talking about migration. So there's never been a peer-reviewed study that has found a statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration. Other things do matter more. The four of them, and you did talk about one of them, by the way, the four of them that matter more are weather, family, where you get a job, and housing prices. So if housing prices are particularly low in a state, it tends to attract migration in, and if housing prices are high, it tends to force people out, or people tend to move out. But there's never been this statistically meaningful correlation between changes in tax policy and migration. One of the best cases that was reviewed on that was New Jersey, where they passed a special millionaires tax. And New Jersey is a special case because it's a state situated in an area where Connecticut, New York, and Philadelphia, a millionaire could migrate easily and still maintain all of her or his business contacts in place because it's such a small geographic area. And they found that 4 years after the passage of this special millionaires tax, out-migration in New Jersey of millionaires did increase by 0.4%. But overall, net millionaire growth in New Jersey went up. It's just the truth that tax policy really doesn't stimulate migration. Illinois is an interesting case. Over the last 96 years, we've had out-migration every single year except one. Apparently, this is a good state to leave. And during the periods of the tax increases, by the way, out-migration slowed down. And it didn't slow down because we increased taxes. People decided, oh, great, I want to be taxed more, I'm going to stay here. It's just an independent variable. Tax policy doesn't stimulate migration. And the people who are leaving Illinois are low and low middle income families because they can't find jobs and their schools are underfunded.
Okay, and then second question. So revenue is only half of the fiscal problems facing the state of Illinois. So, what would you propose or suggest to do about spending problems and issues?
First, amend the Constitution to allow appropriate changes in the pension cost. And Ralph just said, $9 out of $10 gets spent on that list of four kind of nice items of government spending. Ralph, you know that 25% of the budget is going to pensions. That's what's crowding out those other items.
That's the hard cost part. I broke the budget into its two parts. Current
25%
services,
is
the
going
current
to the budget.
services budget, $9 out of $10 are those four things. The hard costs are debt service.
Again, there's a list of 20 or 30 reforms from those things like changing the way we bargain collectively. If you go around to cities around the state, as we have, and talk to the mayors, their hands are tied. All the pension policy is set by Springfield. Everything's an unfunded mandate from Springfield. If they have to go to forced arbitration after collective bargaining, they lose. That's what they tell us. They have no control over negotiating anything. There's something called the prevailing wage law, which is entirely rigged. Basically, the unions set their own prevailing wage, and it's a very high number. That's got to be fixed. There's any number of places where reductions, small and large, have to be made. Bob Fioretti is one of the aldermen in Chicago we sat down and talked to about this. He said there's no question you could just go through Chicago and fire 30% of the workers there. And people that I know that have worked in the city of Chicago say the same thing. Across the board, there are changes that can be made to try to save money.
Okay, so it's an interesting question on spending because Illinois currently has a teacher shortage that is significant. State workers in Illinois, compared to other states on a per capita basis, we're always, in the last 10 years anyway, have ranked 49th or 50th in fewest number of state workers per capita. And we have underfunded all those core services significantly. I talked a little bit about K12. Let me talk about higher ed because maybe people in this room care about higher ed. So in the year 2000, higher ed got a $2.1 billion appropriation from the state of Illinois to help fund it. This year, 20 years later, it's going to get a $1.9 billion appropriation That is less in nominal dollars, not even adjusting for inflation, than what higher ed got 2 decades ago.
But you're excluding their pension cost, right?
No, but I'll talk about the pension cost because I talk about that. We have the only workable solution that's been recognized by independent folks. So I'm okay with talking about the pension cost. But higher ed current appropriations for current services, lower. What has that meant? We started cutting higher ed in 2003 under Governor Rod Blagojevich because if it could be done wrong, Rod sought it out and did it. So we started cutting spending on higher ed then. In 2002, the year before the cuts started, state appropriations for higher ed covered over 70% of the cost of a student attending a public institution of higher learning in our state, and tuitions and fees covered 26%. Those numbers have now flipped because of our cuts. And you wonder why there's such a pressure on tuition and fees for students to pay more to attend institutions of higher learning. It's because state support has evaporated in the last 2 decades. And as to the pension payment, I'll tell you exactly what's going on there. So you got to divide your pension payment into 2 parts. And remember I told you that there was this law passed in 1995. It's called the pension ramp that created a repayment plan for debt service. So this year, the payment to the pension systems, all 5 of them out of our general fund, is roughly $8.2 billion. The actual cost of funding pension benefits is $2.6. All the rest of that is repaying this debt that they borrowed over years because they didn't have enough tax revenue. And by the way, that repayment of debt line is what grows substantially between now and 2045. In fact, by 2045, the repayment of debt by itself as a line item will be over $18 billion. It's not doable. It's not sustainable. It was a crazy pension ramp, and it was a political dodge when it was passed, okay? So the rational thing to do is to re-amortize the debt because that's what's killing us. And as far as amending the Constitution to eliminate pension benefit guarantees, so you're a lawyer, you know this, it won't work. And it won't work why? You can't take away constitutional rights ex post facto.
You haven't read the Rhode Island decision?
Rhode Island doesn't have a constitutional guarantee.
It was the federal issue. that
Rhode
we're talking
Island
about.
doesn't
It was
have a
precisely on point.
constitutional guarantee.
I want to give our
We
students
do.
a chance to ask
You
some
can't
questions
take
here.
away these rights ex post facto. And so yes, I have read the Rhode Island decision. Is completely distinguishable from our case. We're one of only 3 states with a guarantee.
We only
plus
have,
New York and
we have 4
Arizona.
minutes left, guys, so I want to give our students an opportunity. Do we have any questions from the audience? I know some of you are going to have classes you need to get to here in a few minutes, so questions? Don't be shy. Really?
There's a question up front.
All right, here we go. Hang on, can we get you a mic just because we're recording this?
So in terms of the introductory rates, there was a statement made that who's to say that these rates don't get jacked up after they're made. Under my understanding, if that is the case, that they can be moved, who's to say that I guess the people in charge don't just flat them back to what it currently is now and kind of undo the change of the voters?
Okay, so no one has a crystal ball to tell you what's going to happen. We've looked at this argument because it's one that the anti-fair tax people raise all the time. It's one of these slippery slope things that's impossible to either prove or disprove, so it's a great way to scare people away from doing what's right. However, we looked at all 41 states with an income tax, and then we isolated the 32 of them that actually have a graduated rate structure. So 9 of them have flat tax rate structures. And then we looked at the last 20 years and said, all right, have they changed taxes in the last 20 years? And most of them have not. 80% of them have not. The ones that did, 13% of the time, it was a tax increase on the wealthy. And only 5% of the time was it a tax increase that impacted everyone, low, moderate income, and wealthy. So if those trends hold, you're twice as likely to have your taxes cut or have nothing happen to you than you are to have your taxes increased. It's a very difficult thing to increase taxes. Illinois has always been, from a comparison to other states, a relatively low tax state. And we will always be, I think, and we'll never be an outlier on the high tax side.
The short answer to your question is because the governor and the legislature have made it clear that they do want to raise, adopt the rates initially that they said. But again, listen to Ralph's own numbers. He added higher education. We're going to somehow solve higher education's funding problems by this $3.5 billion. He listed the school funding formula, which he had a hand in drafting. We're $6.5 billion short on that. Again, as I mentioned, you could throw all $3.5 billion just into the state pensions, and you would barely stabilize the loss rate on that curve that we're talking about. The actuaries right now say we should be spending $5 billion more on pensions than we are right now. So $3.5 billion is not going to get this manna from heaven that Ralph keeps getting it. And people understand this, and they're going to flee. They're going to know that we're just kicking the can. And by the way, his pension reamortization scheme, what that means is put more money into the pensions sooner. How do we get that more money? Borrow it. That's part of his pension obligation bonds. It's just a huge can kick. That's what's got us there. That's why that ramp looks like this. And he just wants to change the push the ramp out further. Well, change the direction of the ramp by putting more money in sooner. But we don't have that money. You just shift the liability into bonds, one credit card to another.
All right. Unfortunately, due to time, we need to respect our students who have to get to other parts of the campus. I want to thank both of our gentlemen for visiting us. Thank you all for coming, and appreciate it.